in the sprawling mansion overlooking Lake Michigan, where crystal chandeliers cast rainbows on marble floors and silence costs more than most people's yearly salary, there lived a sound that money couldn't buy and couldn't silence. It was the sound of inconsolable crying, piercing through handcrafted walls and custom soundproofing, echoing through corridors lined with priceless art. The sound belonged to baby Charlotte, heir to the Morrison pharmaceutical fortune, and it had been going on for 3 months straight. Pediatricians from Johns Hopkins, sleep specialists from Mayo Clinic, and nannies from the most exclusive agencies in Manhattan had all tried and failed. The crying had become so legendary among Chicago's elite that it was whispered about at charity galas and country club luncheons, how the Morrison baby, born into unimaginable privilege, seemed to reject every comfort money could provide, until one Tuesday morning in September, when something extraordinary happened. As the newest member of the household staff began her work in the basement laundry room, humming an old spiritual her grandmother used to sing, the crying stopped. Not gradually, not with hiccups and sighs, but instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. That voice belonged to Sylvie Washington, and it held a secret that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sylvie Washington had been awake since 4:30 a.m., same as every day for the past 15 years. In her small apartment in Pilsen, she moved through her morning routine with the precision of someone who understood that time was the only currency she truly controlled. Coffee, black, 2 sugars. Toast, wheat bread from the day-old rack at Mariano's, weather check through the kitchen window that faced the alley, where the morning light filtered through the fire escape of the building next door. At 38, Sylvie carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned early that respect was earned through consistency, not demanded through volume. Her hands, calloused from years of industrial washing machines and commercial pressing equipment, moved with practiced efficiency as she prepared for another day at Morrison Estate, a job she'd held for exactly 6 weeks. The commute from Pilsen to Lake Forest took 90 minutes on a good day, involving 2 buses and a 20-minute walk through neighborhoods where the houses grew larger and the sidewalks cleaner with each passing block. Sylvie used this time for what she called her mental preparation, reviewing the day's tasks, practicing the polite but distant demeanor expected of household staff, and most importantly, fortifying herself against the memories that certain melodies could trigger. She'd taken the position at Morrison Estate, not because it paid significantly more than her previous job at the hotel chain, though every extra dollar mattered, but because it offered something rarer, stability. The Morrisons traveled frequently, the house was predictable, and the work, while demanding, was straightforward. After years of employment uncertainty, the promise of steady work felt like a small miracle. What Sylvie didn't expect was the sound that greeted her on her very first day. The crying had started before she'd even entered the service entrance. It wasn't the normal fussing of a newborn. This was something deeper, more desperate, as if the baby was mourning something she couldn't yet name. Margaret Chen, the head of household staff, had briefed Sylvie with the exhausted expression of someone who'd been living in a war zone. "The baby's been like this since she was born," Margaret had explained, leading Sylvie through the mansion's lower level toward the laundry facility. "Doctors say nothing's wrong medically. 3 nannies have quit. Mrs. Morrison barely sleeps. Mr. Morrison started staying at their downtown place most nights." The laundry room was a marvel of efficiency. Commercial-grade washers and dryers, a pressing station that belonged in a luxury hotel, and organizational systems that would make a military quartermaster weep with envy. But even here, 2 floors below the nursery, Charlotte's crying penetrated everything. Sylvie had worked in enough wealthy households to know that rich people's problems weren't inherently more important than anyone else's. But something about that sound, so raw, so inconsolable, stirred something in her chest she'd spent years trying to keep buried. For the first 3 days, Sylvie focused on learning her routines. The Morrison family generated an astonishing amount of laundry. Mr. Morrison's custom suits that required special handling, Mrs. Morrison's silk blouses and designer workout wear, and an endless stream of burp cloths, receiving blankets and onesies that told the story of every failed attempt to comfort baby. Charlotte. It was on her 4th day that everything changed. Sylvie had been sorting through a particularly challenging load, formula stains on cashmere, which required delicate pre-treatment, when she found herself humming. It was unconscious at first, just a low melody that helped her maintain rhythm while she worked. The tune was Wade in the Water, an old spiritual her grandmother used to sing while doing laundry in their tiny kitchen in Bronzeville, back when Sylvie was small enough to stand on a milk crate and help sort colors from whites. The memory should have stopped her cold. For years, Sylvie had avoided music, avoided singing, avoided anything that connected her to the voice that had once been her greatest gift and deepest curse. But something about the repetitive nature of the work, the isolation of the basement room, and perhaps the relentless sound of crying from above had worn down her usual defenses as she worked. The humming grew stronger, more confident. Her voice, unused for so long, was rusty at first, but muscle memory is a powerful thing. The spiritual flowed from her chest, rich and warm, carrying generations of hope and sorrow in its familiar cadences. And then, silence. Not just quiet, but complete, absolute silence from upstairs. Sylvie's hands stilled on the cashmere sweater she'd been treating. In 6 weeks of working at the Morrison estate, she had never experienced this absence of crying. Even during Charlotte's brief naps, there was usually some rustling, some small sound of distress. But now nothing. Sylvie stopped singing, and within 30 seconds the crying resumed, if anything, louder and more desperate than before, heart racing. She began humming again, softly at first. Then, with growing confidence, the crying stopped immediately. She switched to Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, another of her grandmother's favorites, and the silence held. When she tried Amazing Grace, the quiet upstairs seemed to deepen, as if the entire house was holding its breath. For 20 minutes, Sylvie stood in the laundry room, testing the impossible. Every time she sang, Charlotte was quiet. Every time she stopped, the crying resumed. It wasn't coincidence. The timing was too precise, too immediate. Margaret Chen appeared in the doorway, like she'd materialized from thin air. Her usually composed expression showing cracks of amazement and something that looked like relief, so profound it bordered on desperation. "What were you doing?" Margaret whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever spell had just been cast. Sylvie felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to, not because singing was forbidden, but because she'd forbidden it herself years ago. After everything that had happened in Nashville, I was just humming while I worked, Sylvie said carefully. I didn't realize. Mrs. Morrison is upstairs crying, Margaret said, and for the first time since Sylvie had met her, the older woman's voice wavered with emotion, not from frustration or exhaustion, but from relief. Charlotte has been quiet for 23 minutes. That's the longest stretch since she was born. The weight of this revelation settled on Sylvie's shoulders like a familiar burden. Once again, her voice had become entangled with someone else's need, someone else's crisis. Once again, the gift she'd tried so hard to bury had surfaced when someone was desperate enough to need it. I don't understand how it's possible, Margaret continued, studying Sylvie with new intensity. But whatever you were doing, Mrs. Morrison wants to see you immediately. As they walked through the mansion's main level toward the nursery, Sylvie caught glimpses of a life she'd only seen from the periphery. Family photos, documenting a fairy tale romance and wedding, awards and commendations for philanthropic work, evidence of the kind of success story that graced magazine covers and inspired business school case studies. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the woman who met them at the nursery door, Victoria Morrison, wife of pharmaceutical magnate James Morrison, looking like she hadn't slept in months. Her designer clothes hung loose on her frame. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes held the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting an unwinnable war. In her arms, Charlotte Morrison, 3 months old, born into unlimited privilege, heir to a fortune that could buy anything except the one thing she seemed to need, slept peacefully for the first time in her short life. "I don't know how you did it," Victoria Morrison said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter this fragile peace. "But please, whatever it was, can you do it again?" Standing in that nursery, surrounded by every luxury money could buy, holding the attention of one of Chicago's most powerful women, Sylvie felt the familiar tug of a path she'd sworn never to walk again. Her voice, the gift that had lifted her out of poverty, launched her toward dreams too big for a girl from the South Side, and ultimately destroyed everything she'd built, was being called into service once more. This time, though it wasn't about her dreams or ambitions. It was about a baby who couldn't sleep and a mother who was slowly breaking under the weight of her child's inexplicable distress. It was about using the thing she'd buried to help someone else, even if it meant risking the careful, quiet life she'd built in the aftermath of her greatest failure. Sylvie looked down at Charlotte, peaceful in her mother's arms, and made a decision that would change everything. "Yes, ma'am," she said quietly. "I can do it again." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The arrangement they settled on seemed simple enough. Sylvie would spend 30 minutes each morning in the nursery, singing softly while Charlotte settled into her first real nap of the day. In return, the Morrison family would pay her an additional $200 per week, money that could cover her mother's prescription costs with enough left over for the car repairs she'd been putting off for months. But simple arrangements between the powerful and the powerless rarely stay simple. Within a week, word began to spread through the intricate network of Chicago's domestic workforce. Rosa Valdez, who cleaned for the Hendersons 2 blocks away, cornered Sylvie at the bus stop on Thursday morning with questions that felt more like an interrogation. "Is it true you're some kind of miracle worker now?" Rosa asked, her tone carrying the skepticism of someone who'd seen too many household staff members rise and fall in the favor of wealthy employers. "Maria's cousin works for the Petersons, and she heard from someone at the country club that you've got the Morrison baby sleeping through the night." Sylvie pulled her cardigan tighter against the October wind that swept off Lake Michigan. "I just help with the laundry and sometimes sing a little. It's nothing special." But even as she said the words, Sylvie knew they weren't true. What was happening at the Morrison house was special, dangerously, impossibly special. Charlotte didn't just quiet when Sylvie sang. The baby seemed to anticipate her arrival, growing restless around the time Sylvie usually appeared and calming the moment she heard footsteps on the nursery stairs. More troubling was Victoria Morrison's increasing dependence on their arrangement. What started as 30 minutes each morning had stretched to an hour, then 90 minutes. Victoria began timing her own activities around Sylvie's singing sessions, scheduling calls and appointments during the windows when Charlotte would be peacefully sleeping. "Could you possibly stay a few minutes longer today?" became Victoria's daily refrain, asked with the casual entitlement of someone accustomed to buying whatever she needed. "I have a conference call with the board of directors for the foundation, and if Charlotte wakes up," the unfinished sentence hung in the air like a threat. "If Charlotte wakes up," the carefully constructed piece would shatter. If Charlotte wakes up, the Morrison household would return to the chaos that had consumed them for months. If Charlotte wakes up, it would somehow be Sylvie's fault for not preventing it. James Morrison, who Sylvie had barely seen during her first month of employment, began appearing in the nursery doorway during her singing sessions. His presence made the room feel smaller, charged with the kind of masculine energy that evaluated everything in terms of profit and loss. He never spoke to Sylvie directly, but she could feel him calculating, measuring, trying to understand how to quantify and control what she offered. "We should document this," she heard him tell Victoria one morning. His voice carrying from the hallway into the nursery where Sylvie sat beside Charlotte's crib, humming Precious Lord. "Have Dr. Patterson run some tests. Maybe bring in someone from Northwestern to study the acoustic patterns." The idea of being studied, measured, analyzed by medical professionals sent ice water through Sylvie's veins. She'd been down that road before in Nashville when her voice had first gained attention. The recording industry had its own version of testing voice. Coaches and acoustic engineers and marketing specialists who tried to break down her gift into parts they could replicate and sell. That night, Sylvie sat in her apartment kitchen, staring at the phone number she'd kept hidden in her jewelry box for 3 years. Marcus Thompson, her former manager, had given her his personal line the day she'd walked away from everything they'd built together. "If you ever change your mind..." "Sylvie," he'd said, standing in the lobby of the hotel in Nashville where she'd spent her last night before returning to Chicago. "There's still a place for you in this industry. Your voice. Gifts like that don't come around often." She'd never called the number, but she'd kept it, a reminder of the path not taken, the dream she'd abandoned when the cost became too high. Now, as the Morrison family's expectations grew heavier each day, that piece of paper felt like both a lifeline and a trap. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in late October. Sylvie was finishing her regular laundry duties when Margaret Chen appeared in the doorway, her expression more frazzled than usual. "Mrs. Morrison needs you upstairs," Margaret said. "Charlotte's been crying for 2 hours. The nannies can't calm her, and Mrs. Morrison has guests coming for lunch in 30 minutes. Sylvie felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. "I already did the morning session. Charlotte was sleeping when I left the nursery at 10. She woke up early from her nap, and she's been inconsolable ever since. Mrs. Morrison specifically asked for you." The word "asked" was doing heavy lifting in that sentence. Sylvie had worked for enough wealthy families to recognize a command wrapped in polite language. She climbed the stairs to the main level, where Charlotte's crying echoed through the house like an air raid siren. In the nursery, she found Victoria Morrison pacing with Charlotte, her face flushed with frustration and embarrassment. Through the tall windows, Sylvie could see catering trucks arriving in the circular drive, preparing for whatever social obligation was about to unfold. "Thank God you're here," Victoria said, immediately transferring Charlotte to Sylvie's arms. "I don't understand what happened. She was fine this morning after you sang, but then she woke up screaming and nothing works." Charlotte was red-faced and hiccuping, her small body tense with whatever distress had triggered this episode. Sylvie began humming "Wade in the Water," the same song that had started everything, but Charlotte's crying only intensified. Panic flickered in Victoria's eyes. "Why isn't it working?" "It always works." Sylvie tried Amazing Grace, then Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, then every spiritual she could remember from her grandmother's kitchen. Charlotte remained inconsolable, her cries growing more desperate with each failed attempt. "Maybe she needs to hear something different," Sylvie murmured, more to herself than to Victoria. Without thinking, she began singing something she hadn't touched in years, a lullaby she'd written during her time in Nashville, inspired by memories of her own childhood. The melody was simpler than the spirituals, more personal, carrying traces of the South Side apartment where her mother had sung her to sleep, despite working double shifts at the hospital. Charlotte's crying stopped instantly, but the victory felt hollow. Sylvie realized she'd just crossed a line she'd sworn never to cross again. She'd used her own music, not just the traditional songs that belonged to everyone. She'd opened a door she'd spent 3 years keeping locked. "That was beautiful," Victoria said, relief washing over her features. "What was that song?" "I've never heard it before. Just something old," Sylvie lied, gently placing Charlotte in her crib. "I should get back to my regular duties now, But as she turned to leave, Victoria's voice stopped her. "Sylvie, we need to talk about expanding your role here. This gift you have. Charlotte needs more than 30 minutes a day. We're prepared to offer you a significant increase in salary, full-time status, benefits." The offer hung in the air like a golden cage. More money than she'd ever made, security for herself and her mother, a chance to use her voice for something that mattered. But Sylvie had learned the hard way that when wealthy people discovered something they wanted, they didn't stop at buying it, they consumed it entirely. "I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Morrison," Sylvie said carefully, "but I prefer to keep my current arrangement." Victoria's smile faltered. "I don't think you understand. Charlotte needs you. We're not just offering you a job, we're offering you a purpose." The word purpose landed like a blow. It was the same word Marcus Thompson had used in Nashville, the same promise that had convinced her to leave everything she'd known in Chicago and chase a dream that had ultimately destroyed her faith in her own voice. Walking home that evening, Sylvie felt the weight of a decision she wasn't ready to make. She could continue as things were, knowing that each day would bring more pressure to give more of herself, to sing longer, to be available whenever Charlotte needed soothing. Or she could walk away, returning to the quiet anonymity she'd built for herself, leaving behind a baby who seemed to need her voice and a family willing to pay handsomely for it. But there was a third option, one that terrified her more than the others. She could embrace what was happening, accept that her voice was meant to be used, even if it meant risking everything she'd learned about protecting herself from the expectations of others. That night, she pulled out the phone number she'd kept hidden for 3 years and stared at it until her eyes grew heavy. Tomorrow would bring new demands from the Morrison family, new pressure to be something more than just the woman who did their laundry and occasionally sang to their baby. The resistance she felt wasn't just about protecting her carefully constructed life, it was about protecting the parts of herself she'd barely managed to keep intact after Nashville. But as she fell asleep, Charlotte's peaceful face lingered in her mind, along with the memory of Victoria Morrison's desperate gratitude. Some gifts, Sylvie was learning, came with responsibilities that couldn't be easily set aside. The phone call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, jolting Sylvie from the kind of deep sleep that only came after 14-hour days. She fumbled for her phone, heart racing with the automatic assumption that late-night calls meant emergencies, her mother, an accident, something terrible. "Sylvie? This is Victoria Morrison." The voice was strained, exhausted, carrying the hollow echo of someone calling from a bathroom or closet. "I'm so sorry to wake you, but Charlotte won't stop crying, and James is in Shanghai on business, and I've tried everything. Could you possibly? Would it be too much to ask if you could come? I know it's not your normal hours, but I'll pay you double, triple, whatever you need." In the background, Sylvie could hear Charlotte's crying, more intense than anything she'd witnessed during her daytime visits. There was something different about it, more desperate, as if the baby was in genuine distress rather than just unable to settle. "Mrs. Morrison, have you called your pediatrician? If Charlotte's crying is different than usual, Dr. Patterson came by 3 hours ago. She says everything's fine medically, but Charlotte's been like this since 6 p.m. The night Nanny quit yesterday, she said she couldn't handle it anymore. I'm alone here with her, and I don't know what else to do." Sylvie sat up in bed, fully awake now. Through her apartment window, she could see snow beginning to fall, the first real storm of November painting Chicago in white. The buses would be running late, if at all, and a taxi to Lake Forest would cost more than she made in 2 days. "Mrs. Morrison, I don't have reliable transportation this late at night. And with the weather, I'll send the car." "Please, Sylvie." "I'll send David with the car right now." The offer to send the family's driver crossed several invisible lines that separated Sylvie's world from the Morrisons. Household staff didn't get picked up in Blacktown cars. They took public transportation and arrived on time, regardless of weather or personal circumstances. But something in Victoria's voice, a rawness that stripped away all pretense of employer-employee dynamics made Sylvie realize this wasn't about maintaining proper boundaries. "Give me 20 minutes to get dressed," Sylvie heard herself say. The ride to Lake Forest in the Morrison family's Mercedes was surreal. David, the driver, was a quiet man in his 50s who'd worked for the family for a decade. He navigated the snow-slick roads with practiced ease, while Sylvie sat in the leather-appointed back seat, watching Chicago's neighborhoods transform from working-class brick buildings to sprawling suburban estates. "Mrs. Morrison's been having a hard time," David said quietly, his eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror. "Since Mr. Morrison started traveling more for business. The baby's crying, it's wearing her down." It was the most personal information any member of the Morrison staff had shared with Sylvie, and she understood it was both a warning and a plea. Whatever she was walking into wasn't just about a fussy baby. It was about a woman reaching the breaking point of her endurance. The Morrison mansion looked different at midnight, its grand windows glowing like a lighthouse against the storm. Victoria met them at the service entrance, still dressed in the same clothes she'd worn that morning, her hair disheveled and her face showing the strain of 8 hours of unrelieved crying. "She's in the nursery," Victoria said without preamble, leading Sylvie through the house's darkened corridors. "I've tried feeding her, changing her, walking with her, playing white noise, music boxes, nothing works. It's like she's mourning something." The word mourning stopped Sylvie cold. It was the same word she'd thought on her first day at the Morrison house, but hearing it from Victoria's lips gave it new weight. What could a 3-month-old baby possibly have to mourn? In the nursery, Charlotte's crying was indeed different from what Sylvie had heard before. It was rawer, more primal, as if the baby was expressing something that went beyond physical discomfort or even normal infant distress. Victoria lifted Charlotte from her crib and placed her in Sylvie's arms with the desperate efficiency of someone who'd exhausted all other options. Sylvie began with "Wade in the Water," but Charlotte's crying only intensified. She tried "Amazing Grace," then "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," then the lullaby she'd written years ago. Nothing worked. If anything, Charlotte seemed to grow more agitated with each attempt. "I don't understand," Victoria whispered, tears beginning to stream down her face. "It always works. You're the only thing that calms her, and now..." Standing in the nursery at midnight, holding a crying baby while snow painted the windows white, Sylvie felt something shift inside her chest. For months, she'd been treating her gift as a service she provided. 30 minutes of singing in exchange for extra money, a neat transaction that kept her emotional distance intact. But Charlotte's distress was calling for something deeper, something that couldn't be managed or controlled or limited to convenient time slots. Without thinking, Sylvie began singing something she hadn't touched since the worst night of her life in Nashville. It was a song she'd written for her grandmother's funeral, a piece that came from the deepest place in her heart, where grief and love and hope were all tangled together in ways that defied explanation. The melody was simple but devastating, built on the bones of the spirituals her grandmother had taught her, but infused with her own understanding of loss and healing. As she sang, she felt the familiar sensation of her voice finding its true register, not the careful, controlled singing she'd been doing for the Morrison family, but the raw, honest expression that had once made Nashville executives sit up and take notice. Charlotte's crying stopped immediately. But more than that, the baby's entire body seemed to relax in a way Sylvie had never seen before. It was as if Charlotte had been waiting not just for music, but for this specific kind of music, something that acknowledged pain while promising that healing was possible. "My God," Victoria breathed. "What is that song?" "Something I wrote a long time ago," Sylvie said softly, continuing to hum as Charlotte drifted towards sleep. "For someone I loved very much." For the next hour, Sylvie sang songs she hadn't touched in years, not the traditional spirituals that had become her safe repertoire, but the original compositions she'd written during her time in Nashville. Songs about leaving home, about chasing dreams, about the price of ambition and the long road back to yourself. Songs that carried her own story in their melodies, her own heartbreak and healing woven into lyrics she'd been too afraid to sing since everything fell apart. Charlotte slept peacefully through all of it, but Sylvie could feel Victoria's attention intensifying with each song. This wasn't just about soothing a crying baby anymore. It was about revealing the depth of talent Sylvie had been hiding. The artist she'd been before Nashville taught her that her gifts could be weaponized against her. "Sylvie," Victoria said when Charlotte had been settled in her crib and was sleeping deeply, "you're not just someone who sings to babies. You're a real singer, aren't you? A professional." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sylvie could deflect, minimize, return to the safe identity of the laundry worker who occasionally hummed while she folded clothes. Or she could acknowledge the truth she'd been running from for 3 years. "I used to be," Sylvie said finally. "Before I moved back to Chicago. What happened? Why did you stop?" Sylvie looked down at Charlotte, peaceful now in a way that seemed to radiate contentment throughout the room. The baby's crisis had forced her to reach deeper than she'd been willing to go, to access parts of her voice and her story that she'd kept locked away. But in doing so, she'd remembered something she'd forgotten in the aftermath of Nashville. Her music wasn't just about her ambitions or her career. It was about connection, about healing, about using her gift to meet someone else's deepest need. "It's a long story," Sylvie said. "But maybe it's time I started telling it." Victoria nodded, understanding passing between them that transcended employer-employee relationships. "Would you like some coffee? David won't be back to drive you home until morning anyway." As they made their way to the kitchen, leaving Charlotte sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, Sylvie felt the weight of a decision settling on her shoulders. She could continue hiding behind the safe boundaries she'd constructed, or she could take the first real step toward reclaiming the voice that had once carried her dreams. The choice wasn't just about singing to Charlotte anymore. It was about whether she was ready to stop running from the gift that had defined and destroyed and ultimately could redeem her. It was about whether she was brave enough to risk everything she'd built in her quiet life for the possibility of becoming whole again. Looking out at the snow-covered landscape of Lake Forest, so different from the South Side apartment where she'd first discovered her voice, Sylvie realized that some journeys only began when you stopped trying to control where they might lead. The first step, she was learning, was always the hardest and the most necessary. The conversation in the Morrison kitchen lasted until dawn, fueled by coffee that grew cold in their cups, as Sylvie found herself telling a story she'd kept locked away for 3 years. Victoria listened with the focused attention of someone who understood what it meant to have dreams that felt both necessary and dangerous. "I was 24 when I first went to Nashville," Sylvie said, watching snowflakes melt against the kitchen window as the sun began to rise over Lake Michigan. "My grandmother had just passed, and she'd left me a little money, not much, but enough for a one-way bus ticket and 2 months' rent in a studio apartment near Music Row." The words came easier than she'd expected, maybe because Victoria didn't interrupt with questions or advice, just listened with the kind of presence that made secrets feel safe to share. "I had this idea that if I could just get to Nashville, if I could get someone to hear me sing, everything would fall into place. My grandmother always said I had a voice that could heal hearts. And I thought that meant I was supposed to be on stage somewhere, touching thousands of people at once." Victoria refilled their coffee cups, her movements careful and quiet in the pre-dawn stillness. "What happened when you got there?" "For the first year, nothing. I sang in hotel lobbies during tourist season, played open mic nights at dive bars, auditioned for every label and management company that would see me. I was good enough to get noticed, but Nashville is full of people who are good enough to get noticed." Sylvie paused, remembering those early days when her voice had felt like a passport to a future she could barely imagine. The excitement of walking down Music Row, The thrill of hearing her songs played back through professional sound systems, the intoxicating possibility that she might actually make it. Then I met Marcus Thompson. He was a talent manager, not one of the big names, but connected enough to matter. He heard me at a songwriter's showcase and said I had something special, not just the voice, but the stories. The way I could take an old spiritual and make it feel contemporary without losing its soul. He sounds like he believed in you. He did. Maybe too much. Sylvie stared into her coffee, seeing Nashville studio sessions and late-night recording sessions in the dark surface. Marcus got me signed to Meridian Records, not a major label, but legitimate. They put real money behind me, hired top-tier producers, booked studio time that cost more per hour than I'd made in a month back in Chicago. Victoria leaned forward, genuinely interested. That sounds like everything you'd dreamed of. It was. For about 18 months, we cut an album, got radio play on several markets, toured with established acts as an opening performer. I was making more money than anyone in my family had ever seen. Marcus kept talking about the next level, major label interest, headlining tours, Grammy nominations. The success had been intoxicating, Sylvie remembered. Not just the money or recognition, but the feeling that her grandmother's faith in her voice had been vindicated. Every sold-out club, every radio interview, every fan who approached her after shows to say her music had helped them through difficult times. It all felt like proof that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. What changed? Victoria asked gently. Sylvie took a deep breath, approaching the part of the story that still felt like walking on broken glass. Marcus started pushing me to evolve my sound. He said the spiritual-influenced material was limiting my market appeal. Too niche, too specifically black, too tied to traditions that made white audiences uncomfortable. She could see the understanding. Dawn in Victoria's eyes, the recognition of a story that had been playing out in the music industry for decades. He wanted me to do more pop-influenced material, work with different producers, appeal to a broader demographic. And the label supported him. They said it was about reaching my full potential, maximizing my impact. But it wasn't really about your potential, was it? No, it was about their bottom line. The spirituals and original songs that had gotten me noticed were too authentic, too rooted in my actual experience. They wanted the voice without the story, the gift without the culture that had shaped it. Sylvie remembered the recording sessions that followed, how her voice had felt disconnected from her heart for the first time in her life. Singing lyrics written by committee, melodies designed by market research, arrangements that showcased her technical ability while stripping away everything that made her music meaningful. I went along with it at first because I trusted Marcus, and because I thought maybe they were right. Maybe I needed to be more flexible, more commercial. But every time I performed those new songs, I felt like I was betraying my grandmother's memory, abandoning everything that had brought me to Nashville in the first place. When did you realize you needed to stop? The question hit the center of everything Sylvie had been avoiding for 3 years. The moment when compromise became betrayal, when adaptation became self-destruction. There was a showcase at the Grand Ole Opry. Marcus had arranged for major label executives to attend, people who could have changed my entire career. I was supposed to perform 3 of the new songs, the ones designed to prove I could be whatever they needed me to be. Sylvie could still feel the stage lights, still remember the faces in the audience, industry professionals with notebooks and smartphones, calculating her market value with every note she sang. I got through the first 2 songs, but when I started the third one, I just stopped. Mid-verse, in front of 200 people who had come specifically to evaluate my commercial potential. I looked out at that audience and realized I didn't recognize my own voice anymore. Victoria nodded, her expression showing she understood the weight of that moment, the collision between artistic integrity and commercial pressure that had destroyed so many creative people. What did you do? I sang Precious Lord instead, a cappella, no microphone, no accompaniment. Just me and the song my grandmother used to hum while she cooked Sunday dinner, the way she taught it to me when I was 7 years old. Sitting on a milk crate in her kitchen, the memory still gave Sylvie chills, the moment when her authentic voice filled that historic space, when the calculated performance became real communion between artist and audience. The response was incredible. People were crying, standing up. Some of the industry executives were taking notes like they'd discovered something completely new. But Marcus was furious. He said I'd embarrassed him, undermined months of careful positioning, potentially destroyed relationships with people who could make or break my career. He didn't understand what you'd actually accomplished. No, to him, I'd just thrown away everything we'd been working toward. And maybe he was right in terms of the career path we'd mapped out. The major label executives loved the performance, but they wanted me to recreate that authenticity on command, package it in radio-friendly formats, tour it through markets that would buy tickets without understanding what they were really hearing. Sylvie finished her coffee, tasting the bitterness that had nothing to do with the brewing. I realized that night that I had a choice. I could give them my voice on their terms and probably achieve everything I'd dreamed of when I first arrived in Nashville. Or I could walk away and try to figure out what my voice was supposed to be for. So you left. I left. Broke my contract, paid back the advance money with interest, disappointed everyone who had believed in my commercial potential. Marcus didn't speak to me for 6 months. The label released me without ceremony. I came back to Chicago with less money than I'd had when I first left, but at least I still recognized myself in the mirror. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, processing the story and its implications. Finally, she said, "And now you're here, using your voice to heal my daughter. It's different with Charlotte. She doesn't have any agenda, any expectations about what my voice should accomplish. She just needs what she needs, and somehow I can provide it. Maybe that's what your grandmother meant," Victoria said thoughtfully, "about having a voice that could heal hearts. Maybe it was never about the size of the audience. The suggestion hung between them like a possibility Sylvie hadn't considered. For 3 years, she'd thought of her Nashville experience as a failure, a cautionary tale about the dangers of compromising your authentic self. But sitting in the Morrison kitchen as Charlotte slept peacefully upstairs, she began to wonder if Nashville had been preparation rather than destination, a place where she'd learned to recognize the difference between performing her gift and actually using it. "Mrs. Morrison," Sylvie said carefully, "what you're suggesting, using my voice this way for Charlotte, it means getting close to people. It means risking the kind of emotional investment that can get complicated." Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile Sylvie had seen from her since Charlotte's birth. "Sylvie, I think it's time you called me Victoria. And I think maybe complicated isn't always a bad thing." As David arrived to drive her home through the snowy Chicago morning, Sylvie felt something shifting in her understanding of what her voice was meant to accomplish. The learning phase, she realized, wasn't just about acquiring new skills. It was about discovering what those skills were actually for. The morning Sylvie's carefully constructed world began to unravel started like any other. She arrived at the Morrison estate at her usual time, carrying the thermos of coffee she'd started bringing since the late-night sessions with Charlotte became a regular occurrence. Victoria met her at the service entrance with Charlotte in her arms, both looking rested for the first time since Sylvie had started working there. "She slept through the night," Victoria said, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and amazement. 8 hours straight. "I actually had to check on her twice to make sure she was breathing." Sylvie took Charlotte, marveling at how the baby seemed to mold into her arms like they'd been designed to fit together. Over the past 2 weeks, since the midnight emergency and the dawn conversation in the kitchen, their routine had evolved into something that felt more like collaboration than employment. Charlotte would fuss until Sylvie arrived, settle immediately when she began singing, and sleep peacefully for hours afterward. "James is coming home tonight," Victoria mentioned as they walked toward the nursery. He's been in Shanghai for 10 days, but the board meeting got moved up, so he's flying back early. Something in Victoria's tone made Sylvie pause. Is that a problem? Not exactly. It's just, James has very specific ideas about how things should work. Structure, measurable outcomes, clear boundaries between professional services and personal relationships. The warning was subtle but unmistakable. James Morrison's return would bring scrutiny to the arrangement that had developed organically between Sylvie and his family. What felt natural and healing to Victoria might look dangerously informal to a man who ran a pharmaceutical empire. Sylvie was humming Amazing Grace to Charlotte when she heard voices in the hallway, Victoria's familiar cadence, mixed with a deeper, more commanding tone. James Morrison's presence filled the doorway before he actually appeared. The kind of masculine energy that evaluated everything in terms of efficiency and return on investment. So this is our miracle worker, James said, studying Sylvie with the analytical gaze of someone accustomed to making decisions based on data rather than emotion. He was younger than Sylvie had expected, probably early 40s, with the kind of polished appearance that came from custom suits and personal trainers. James, meet Sylvie Washington, Victoria said carefully. Sylvie, this is my husband. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Morrison, Sylvie said, continuing to rock Charlotte gently. The baby was drifting towards sleep, and any disruption now could undo 30 minutes of careful soothing. Victoria tells me Charlotte only sleeps when you sing to her, James said, his tone suggesting he found this both fascinating and problematic. How do you explain that phenomenon? The question felt like a trap. Sylvie could feel Victoria's tension from across the room, the careful way she was watching her husband's reaction to something that had become precious to her. I don't really try to explain it. Mr. Morrison, babies respond to different things. Charlotte seems to like music, particularly certain melodies that only you can provide. Apparently, James stepped closer, studying Charlotte's peaceful expression with clinical interest. Victoria mentioned you have professional musical training? Some experience, yes, sir. In Nashville, I understand. Country music industry? The specificity of his knowledge caught Sylvie off guard. She glanced at Victoria, who looked equally surprised. How much had James investigated her background and why? I spent some time there, yes, working with Meridian Records under management by Marcus Thompson. Your stage name was Sylvie Grace, and you released one album that achieved moderate regional success before you terminated your contracts and returned to Chicago. The room went completely silent, except for Charlotte's soft breathing. Sylvie felt exposed, as if James had reached into her carefully constructed privacy and pulled out pieces of a life she'd thought she'd left behind. James, Victoria said sharply, what's this about? Due diligence, he replied, without taking his eyes off Sylvie. When someone has unprecedented influence over our daughter's well-being, I make it my business to understand who they are and what they want. I don't want anything from your family, Mr. Morrison, Sylvie said quietly. I'm here to do my job. Which job? Laundry services or private musical performances? Because, according to our household expense records, you've been receiving additional compensation for services that aren't clearly defined in your employment contract. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Sylvie realized she was being positioned as someone who had overstepped boundaries, who had perhaps taken advantage of Victoria's desperation to extract more money from the family. The additional payment was my idea, Victoria said firmly. Sylvie provides a service that benefits our entire household. Charlotte sleeps, I can rest, and our family functions better. It's worth every penny we pay her. I'm sure it is. But what happens when Sylvie decides she wants more money? Or when she gets a better offer somewhere else? Or when she decides to return to her music career and leaves us with a baby who can't sleep without her? Each question landed like a physical blow. James Morrison had identified every vulnerability in the arrangement, every way it could collapse and leave Charlotte and Victoria devastated. That's not my intention, Sylvie said. Intentions change. Circumstances change. People change. James moved to the window, looking out at the manicured grounds of his estate. What I'm proposing is a more sustainable solution. We formalize your role here, bring in specialists to study your methods, perhaps record your sessions so we can understand the acoustic elements that make them effective. Record my sessions. Dr. Helena Vasquez from Northwestern's Pediatric Sleep Clinic has expressed interest in documenting your work. We could contribute to scientific understanding while ensuring Charlotte's needs are met, even if you're unavailable. The suggestion felt like a violation, turning her intimate moments with Charlotte into research data. Sylvie remembered the recording sessions in Nashville, where every note had been analyzed and adjusted until her voice no longer felt like her own. "I'm not comfortable being recorded," Sylvie said carefully. "Then we have a problem," James replied. "Because what's happening now isn't sustainable. You're creating a dependency that could be catastrophic if it's suddenly removed." Charlotte stirred in Sylvie's arms, responding to the tension in the room. Sylvie began humming softly, but for the first time since she'd started working with Charlotte, the baby didn't immediately settle. Instead, Charlotte began to fuss, her small body growing tense, as if she could sense the conflict swirling around her. "See?" James said. "She's already reacting to disruptions in the routine. What happens when you get sick, or when you decide this job doesn't pay enough, or when you want to pursue other opportunities?" "James, stop," Victoria said, her voice strained. "You're making it worse." But Charlotte's fussing was escalating into full crying, and Sylvie's usual songs weren't working. The baby seemed to be picking up on the adult's emotional state, creating a feedback loop of distress that grew more intense with each passing minute. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," James said over Charlotte's cries. "We've created a situation where our daughter's well-being depends entirely on one person's availability and willingness to help. That's not a solution, it's a dependency." Sylvie stood up, pacing with Charlotte, while trying different melodies, but nothing was working. The baby's crying filled the nursery, echoing off the walls with the kind of desperate intensity that had characterized her first months of life. "Maybe I should go," Sylvie said, feeling the weight of failure settling on her shoulders. "Let you work this out as a family." "No," Victoria said quickly. "Please don't go. James, can we discuss this somewhere else? You're upsetting Charlotte." "I'm not the one who created this unsustainable situation," James replied, "but I am the one who's going to solve it." As Sylvie left the Morrison estate that morning, with Charlotte still crying upstairs, she felt the familiar sting of having her gift questioned and commoditized. James Morrison's concerns weren't entirely wrong. She was creating a dependency that could become problematic. But his solutions felt like the same kind of reduction she'd experienced in Nashville, turning something sacred into something measurable and controllable. Walking to the bus stop through the cold November morning, Sylvie realized she was facing a choice she'd hoped to avoid. She could accept James Morrison's terms, formalize her role, submit to recording and analysis, become a documented case study in pediatric sleep solutions. Or she could walk away, leaving Charlotte and Victoria to deal with the consequences. Neither option felt right. But staying might mean sacrificing the authentic connection that made her voice effective in the first place. The first major challenge, Sylvie was learning, wasn't always about external obstacles. Sometimes it was about refusing to let other people's limitations define what was possible. Charlotte needed her voice, but not in the way James Morrison wanted to package and control it. Finding a way to honor both needs would require something Sylvie had never been particularly good at, standing up for the value of what she offered without apology or compromise. Sylvie didn't go to work the next day, for the first time since she'd started at the Morrison estate. She called in sick, not because she was physically ill, but because she needed time to think without the pressure of Charlotte's immediate needs clouding her judgment. She spent the morning at her mother's apartment in Bronzeville, sitting at the same kitchen table where she'd first learned to harmonize with her grandmother's voice 30 years earlier. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world." her mother, Dorothy Washington, observed as she set a cup of tea in front of Sylvie. At 63, Dorothy moved with the careful precision of someone managing diabetes and arthritis, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "What's got you so twisted up?" Sylvie found herself explaining the situation at the Morrison house, James's ultimatum, the proposal to record and study her sessions, the way Charlotte had responded to the tension in the room. She left out the financial details and some of the more personal elements of her relationship with Victoria. But the core dilemma came through clearly. "So this man wants to turn your gift into some kind of science experiment," Dorothy said when Sylvie finished. "And you're wondering whether you should let him. It's not that simple. Mama, Charlotte really does need what I can give her. And if they could figure out how to replicate it, maybe other babies could benefit too." Dorothy sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Your grandmother used to say something about gifts and responsibilities. You remember what that was?" Sylvie smiled despite her anxiety. Her grandmother's sayings had been a constant soundtrack to her childhood. Bits of wisdom that seemed simple on the surface, but revealed deeper truths over time. She said gifts are given to us, but how we use them is up to us. That's right. Not how other people want us to use them, not how they think we should use them. How we choose to use them. Dorothy reached across the table and covered Sylvie's hand with her own. "Sounds to me like you already know what you want to do. You're just scared to do it." The phone rang as Sylvie was washing their teacups. She expected it to be Margaret Chen or maybe Victoria calling to check on her absence. Instead, the caller ID showed a number she recognized but hadn't seen in 3 years. "Marcus Thompson calling," she answered. Her voice carefully neutral. Sylvie Grace Washington, Marcus's familiar voice, filled the kitchen. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you again. I didn't call you. No, but someone else did. James Morrison, CEO of Morrison Pharmaceuticals. Seems he's got questions about your time in Nashville, and he tracked down your former representation." Sylvie felt ice water in her veins. James Morrison had not only researched her background, but had actually contacted her former manager. The invasion of privacy felt complete and deliberate. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you were one of the most naturally gifted vocalists I ever worked with, and that you walked away from a career that could have made you a household name because you couldn't handle the commercial pressures." The characterization stung, even though it wasn't entirely inaccurate. "Is that why you're calling? To relitigate our professional relationship?" "I'm calling because Morrison made me an offer. He wants to hire me to manage your return to professional music. Apparently, you've discovered some kind of therapeutic application for your voice, and he thinks there's a market for it." Sylvie sat down heavily at her mother's kitchen table. "What kind of market?" "Pediatric sleep therapy, stress reduction for high-net-worth individuals, maybe even clinical applications in hospitals and treatment centers. He's talking about a whole business model built around your specific vocal abilities." The audacity was breathtaking. James Morrison wasn't just trying to control her work with Charlotte. He was trying to rebuild her entire career around his vision of how her gift should be monetized. "And you're interested in this?" "Sylvie, I never stop believing in your commercial potential. If Morrison wants to fund a comeback, if he's got the connections to make it happen on a scale we never achieved before, why wouldn't I be interested?" "Because it's exactly the same trap that destroyed us the first time," Sylvie thought, but didn't say. Instead, she asked, "What exactly is Morrison proposing?" "Full management contract, recording deal with his backing. Development of standardized therapeutic programs based on your methods. He's talking about investing serious money in research and development, creating something that could help thousands of people while making you wealthy in the process." "And what would I have to do?" "Submit to comprehensive acoustic analysis so they can understand the technical elements that make your voice effective. Work with their research team to develop replicable protocols. Record a series of therapeutic albums under clinical supervision." Every element Marcus described felt like a betrayal of what made her connection with Charlotte meaningful. The idea of reducing those intimate moments in the nursery to technical specifications and marketing strategies made her stomach turn. "I need to think about it," Sylvie said. "Don't think too long." Morrison made it clear that his offer has an expiration date. He's got other options if you're not interested in pursuing this opportunity. After Marcus hung up, Sylvie sat in her mother's kitchen, feeling like she was being pulled apart by competing forces. On one side was financial security, professional validation, and the possibility of helping more people than just one baby. On the other side was the intuitive knowledge that what happened in Charlotte's nursery couldn't be packaged and sold without losing its essential nature. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. "Charlotte hasn't stopped crying since you left yesterday. James hired a pediatric sleep specialist, but nothing works. Please call me when you can." The message was followed by an audio file, 30 seconds of Charlotte's inconsolable crying, the sound that had first brought Sylvie into the Morrison family's orbit. But this crying was different, more desperate, as if Charlotte was mourning not just her own distress, but the absence of something that had become essential to her well-being. Sylvie closed her eyes and listened to the recording again. And suddenly she understood something that had been eluding her for weeks. Charlotte's response to her voice wasn't just about acoustic properties or vocal techniques that could be studied and replicated. It was about genuine connection, about one human being offering comfort to another without agenda or analysis. The baby could sense the difference between authentic care and clinical intervention. She responded to Sylvie's voice, not because of any measurable qualities, but because those songs carried love, attention, and presence that couldn't be manufactured or mass-produced. "Mama," Sylvie said, looking at her mother across the kitchen table. "What if the gift isn't meant to be shared with thousands of people? What if it's meant to be shared completely with just a few?" Dorothy smiled the way she had when Sylvie was 7 years old and finally understood a lesson she'd been trying to teach. "Then you use it the way it's meant to be used, baby girl. And you don't let anyone convince you that bigger is always better." That afternoon, Sylvie made 3 phone calls. The first was to Marcus Thompson. "I appreciate the offer," she said, "but I'm not interested in returning to professional music. Not on Morrison's terms or anyone else's." The second was to James Morrison directly. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you've been researching my background and making plans for my future. I need you to know that I won't be participating in any recording or analysis sessions. My work with Charlotte is personal, not professional, and it will remain that way." The third call was to Victoria. "I'm coming back to work tomorrow," Sylvie said, "and I have some things I need to say to your husband." That evening, Sylvie sat in her apartment and did something she hadn't done since leaving Nashville. She wrote a new song. Not for commercial production or therapeutic application, but for Charlotte Morrison, a baby who had taught her that the most powerful way to use a gift was to give it freely, completely, and without reservation. The breakthrough wasn't about finding a way to make her voice more effective or more valuable. It was about understanding that some things were too precious to be commoditized, and that real healing happened in the space between authentic offering and genuine need. Tomorrow, she would return to the Morrison estate not as an employee hoping to keep her job, but as someone who finally understood the true value of what she had to offer. The question wasn't whether James Morrison would accept her terms. It was whether she was brave enough to enforce them. Sylvie arrived at the Morrison estate the next morning to find chaos waiting for her. 3 cars were parked in the circular drive that usually sat empty during weekday mornings. A silver BMW she didn't recognize, Dr. Patterson's familiar Honda, and a white van marked Northwestern Medical Center Sleep Research Division. Margaret Chen met her at the service entrance, her usually composed demeanor cracking under obvious stress. "Thank God you're here. It's been difficult." Through the house, Sylvie could hear Charlotte crying with the raw intensity that had become heartbreakingly familiar over the past 24 hours. But layered underneath the baby's distress were adult voices, clinical analytical discussions that treated Charlotte's suffering as a fascinating case study rather than a child in need. "What's happening?" Sylvie asked as they walked through the lower level. Mr. Morrison brought in Dr. Helena Vasquez from Northwestern and her research team. They've been here since 6 a.m., setting up monitoring equipment and trying different interventions. Charlotte has been crying for 14 hours straight. Margaret's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been listening to an inconsolable baby all night, but also something deeper, disapproval of the clinical invasion that had transformed the Morrison home into a makeshift laboratory. As they climbed the stairs toward the nursery, the voices became clearer. Dr. Vasquez was speaking in the measured tones of someone accustomed to presenting findings to medical conferences. The infant's crying pattern shows no response to standard acoustic interventions. We've tried white noise at various frequencies, classical music, recorded lullabies, and even digitally enhanced versions of maternal vocalizations. The crying intensity remains constant at approximately 85 decibels, which confirms that whatever Miss Washington does is genuinely unique. James Morrison's voice carried the satisfaction of someone whose hypothesis was being validated. The question is whether we can identify and replicate the active elements. Sylvie paused outside the nursery door, taking in the scene through the partially open doorway. Charlotte lay in a portable monitoring crib, surrounded by electronic equipment, sensors attached to her chest, a microphone positioned near her head, tablets and laptops displaying real-time data about her vital signs and vocal patterns. Victoria sat in the corner chair looking like she hadn't slept in days, her face showing the hollow exhaustion of a mother watching her child being treated as a research subject. When she saw Sylvie in the doorway, tears of relief flooded her eyes. "Sylvie," she whispered, standing up so quickly she nearly knocked over a medical cart. "Please, she won't stop crying." Dr. Vasquez looked up from her tablet with professional interest. "You must be Miss Washington. I'm Dr. Vasquez from Northwestern's Pediatric Sleep Clinic. We've been documenting the infant's response patterns in preparation for analyzing your intervention methods." The clinical language, infant instead of Charlotte, intervention methods instead of singing, made Sylvie's skin crawl. She looked at Charlotte, red-faced and exhausted from crying, surrounded by equipment that measured everything except what she actually needed. "Have you tried just holding her?" Sylvie asked. "Physical comfort was one of our first interventions," Dr. Vasquez replied. "The crying intensity decreased marginally, but resumed within minutes. We're looking for more sustainable solutions." James Morrison stepped forward, his expression showing the controlled impatience of someone accustomed to solving problems through systematic analysis. "Miss Washington, we've documented Charlotte's baseline distress levels. If you could begin your usual routine, we can monitor the changes in real time and identify the specific acoustic elements that produce the therapeutic effect." The request felt like a trap disguised as an opportunity. Sylvie looked around the nursery, at the monitoring equipment, the research team with their clipboards and tablets, James Morrison with his expectant expression, and realized that agreeing to sing under these conditions would validate everything she'd decided to reject. "I need everyone except Victoria and Charlotte to leave the room," Sylvie said. Quietly, Dr. Vasquez looked up from her equipment with surprise. "I'm sorry, but we need to document the intervention in real time. The acoustic analysis requires—" "I said everyone needs to leave." The authority in Sylvie's voice surprised even her. It wasn't the deferential tone she'd used during months of employment, but something deeper, the voice of someone who understood exactly what she had to offer and refused to let it be diminished. "Miss Washington," James said, his tone carrying the warning edge of someone whose patience was being tested, "you're here as an employee. The research team is here at my invitation to help solve my daughter's medical issues. You don't get to dictate the terms of their work. Actually, I do. Sylvie stepped fully into the room, her attention focused entirely on Charlotte, despite the adult tensions swirling around her. Because what Charlotte needs can't be documented or replicated or turned into a research study. It can only be given freely, without analysis or expectation. She moved to Charlotte's crib, gently removing the sensors and monitoring equipment despite Dr. Vasquez's protests. The baby's crying intensified at first, but as Sylvie lifted her from the clinical environment and cradled her against her chest, Charlotte seemed to recognize that something fundamental had changed. "You're interfering with important medical research," Dr. Vasquez said sharply. "This infant presents a unique case study that could benefit thousands of children with similar conditions." "This baby," Sylvie corrected, emphasizing Charlotte's humanity, "needs comfort, not research. She needs someone to care about her well-being more than her potential." Contribution to medical literature. James Morrison's face hardened with the expression of someone unaccustomed to having his authority challenged. "Miss Washington, you're overstepping your boundaries. Put Charlotte back in the monitoring equipment immediately, or your employment with this family is terminated." The ultimatum hung in the air like a challenge. Sylvie felt the familiar weight of choosing between security and authenticity, between compromise and integrity. But this time, holding Charlotte in her arms, she felt something she'd never experienced during her Nashville crisis: absolute clarity about what mattered most. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice steady and calm, "you can't fire me because I quit." The words surprised her even as she spoke them, but they felt completely right. She was done being employed by people who wanted to control her gift. She was done allowing others to define the terms under which she used her voice. Without waiting for a response, Sylvie began singing the song she'd written the night before, not the traditional spirituals she'd been relying on, but something entirely new, created specifically for Charlotte's healing. The melody was simple but profound, carrying every lesson she'd learned about love, loss, authenticity, and the courage required to offer your whole self without reservation. Charlotte's crying stopped immediately, but more than that, her entire body seemed to melt into peaceful surrender. The baby's breathing deepened, her fists unclenched, and her face relaxed into an expression of contentment that had been absent for days. "Remarkable," Dr. Vasquez whispered, reaching for her tablet to record observations. "Don't," Sylvie said without breaking her song. "This isn't for your research. This is for Charlotte." For 20 minutes, Sylvie sang to Charlotte while the research team stood frozen in professional frustration, and James Morrison calculated the implications of losing his daughter's only source of peace. But Victoria watched with tears streaming down her face, understanding that she was witnessing something that transcended employment or clinical intervention. She was seeing what unconditional love looked like when it had found its proper purpose. When Charlotte was finally sleeping deeply, Sylvie gently placed her in the crib and turned to face James Morrison. "Your daughter doesn't need to be studied or analyzed or turned into a case study. She needs to be loved and cared for without agenda. That's something you can't buy, research, or control. And what exactly are you proposing?" James asked, his voice tight with the frustration of someone whose solutions had been rejected. "I'm not proposing anything to you," Sylvie replied. "I'm offering Victoria and Charlotte something you can't provide. My voice, my presence, and my care given freely because they need it, not because you can afford to pay for it." She looked at Victoria, who was staring at her sleeping daughter with wonder. "If you want me to continue helping Charlotte, it won't be as your employee. It will be as someone who chooses to be here because I care about you both." The challenge was complete, not just to James Morrison's authority, but to everything he represented about controlling and commoditizing human connection. Sylvie had found her voice in more ways than one, and she was finally ready to use it on her own terms. The ultimate test wasn't about proving her value to others. It was about valuing herself enough to protect the authenticity that made her gift meaningful in the first place. 6 months later, Sylvie Washington sat in a community center in Pilsen, watching a circle of mothers rock their babies while she led them through the gentle melodies that had become the foundation of her new life's work. The fluorescent lights were harsh compared to the crystal chandeliers of the Morrison estate, and the folding chairs were a far cry from the antique furniture that had once surrounded her. But the peace on the babies' faces was identical. "Remember," she told the group softly as they hummed together, "it's not about having a perfect voice. It's about offering your voice with love. Your baby doesn't need you to sound like a professional. They need you to sound like home." Maria Santos, a young mother from the neighborhood, looked up with tired but hopeful eyes. "Elena has been sleeping better since we started coming here. Not through the night yet, but longer stretches. My grandmother says it's because she can feel the love in the music." The transformation in Sylvie's life hadn't happened overnight. After she quit her position at the Morrison estate, there had been weeks of uncertainty about what came next. She'd used her savings to help with her mother's medical expenses and had taken a part-time job at a local laundromat to pay her rent while she figured out how to use her gift in a way that felt authentic and sustainable. The answer came from Victoria Morrison, who had called 3 weeks after the confrontation with James and the research team. "I need to see you," Victoria had said during that phone call, her voice carrying an urgency that went beyond Charlotte's needs. Not about singing to Charlotte, about something bigger. They met at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, neutral territory between Sylvie's world and the Morrison family's Lake Forest estate. Victoria looked different, stronger, more decisive, as if she'd found some essential part of herself that had been missing during the months of Charlotte's crisis. "James and I are separating," Victoria said without preamble. "Not because of what happened with you, but because of what it revealed about how differently we approach the things that matter most." Sylvie had felt a mixture of sadness and inevitability at the news. The Morrison marriage had been under strain long before she'd entered their lives, but Charlotte's needs had exposed fundamental differences in how they understood love, control, and what it meant to provide for their child. "Charlotte is doing well," Victoria continued. "She sleeps through the night now, plays happily during the day, is developing normally in every way. But I keep thinking about something you said, about gifts being meant to be shared completely with just a few people rather than partially with thousands." Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a business plan, carefully typed and bound, with the heading "Harmony Haven, Community Healing Through Music." "I want to fund a program," Victoria said. "Not research, not clinical trials, not anything that turns your gift into data. A community center where mothers can learn to use their own voices to comfort their babies. Where people dealing with grief or trauma can find healing through music. Where your gift becomes a seed that grows into something bigger than what any one person could accomplish alone." The proposal had taken Sylvie's breath away. It was everything she hadn't known she'd been hoping for. A way to use her voice that honored its authentic power while sharing it in a manner that respected both the gift and the people who needed it. "Why would you do this?" Sylvie had asked. "Because you saved my daughter," Victoria replied simply. "Not through some clinical intervention or research protocol, but by caring about her as a whole human being. And because I think there are other mothers out there who need what you can teach them, not how to sound like you, but how to find their own voices." The program had started small, with just 6 mothers meeting twice a week in a rented room at the Pilsen Community Center. Sylvie taught them simple lullabies, breathing techniques, and most importantly, how to trust that their voices, imperfect, untrained, but filled with love, were exactly what their children needed. Word spread through the network of mothers the way important information always did, quietly, personally, from one desperate parent to another who had found something that actually helped. The group grew to 12 mothers, then 20, then 30. Women came not just with babies, but with toddlers who struggled to sleep, with teenagers who seemed angry at the world, with aging parents whose minds were beginning to fade. Sylvie had been nervous about working with older children at first. unsure whether her gift would translate beyond the primal needs of infancy. But she discovered that the fundamental principle remained the same. People of all ages responded to authentic presence, to being seen and valued without judgment, to voices that carried love rather than performance. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman whose early-stage dementia made her anxious and confused, would calm completely when the group sang the old hymns she remembered from her childhood. 12-year-old David, brought by his grandmother because he'd been acting out since his father deployed overseas, had initially sat silent in the corner but gradually began humming along, then singing, then sharing stories about missing his dad. The most profound transformation, however, was in Sylvie herself. For the first time since leaving Nashville, she felt completely aligned with how she was using her gift. There was no pressure to perform, no agenda to fulfill, no metrics to meet. There was only the simple, powerful act of sharing her voice with people who needed it, and teaching them to find their own. Charlotte Morrison, now 9 months old, was a regular visitor to Harmony Haven. Victoria would bring her once a week, not because Charlotte needed Sylvie's intervention anymore, but because both mother and daughter had become part of the community that had grown around authentic healing. "She remembers you," Victoria said during one of these visits, watching Charlotte crawl happily among the other children while their mothers shared songs and stories. "When you start singing, she gets this look on her face, like she's recognizing an old friend." The financial arrangement Victoria had created was unlike anything Sylvie had experienced. Instead of being paid for services rendered, she received a monthly stipend that allowed her to focus entirely on the community program. Victoria covered all expenses: rent for the community center space, materials for the families, even a small scholarship fund for mothers who couldn't afford bus fare to attend sessions. "It's not charity," Victoria had insisted when Sylvie expressed concern about accepting such generous support. "It's investment in something that works, something that makes the world a little better without requiring anyone to sacrifice their authenticity to receive it." The program had also attracted attention from social workers, pediatricians, and therapists who saw the results in their clients' families. But Victoria, true to her word, had refused all requests to formalize, study, or standardize what happened at Harmony Haven. "The moment we turn this into a clinical program or a research study," she told a persistent researcher from the University of Chicago, "we kill the very thing that makes it effective." James Morrison had made one attempt to regain control over what his former wife and daughter had become part of. He'd sent lawyers to investigate the program, looking for regulatory violations or liability issues that might force it to operate under medical supervision. But Victoria's legal team had been thorough in ensuring that Harmony Haven operated as a community support program rather than a healthcare service, making it immune to the kind of oversight James might have imposed. As Sylvie looked around the community center that evening, watching mothers comfort their children with songs they'd learned to trust, she understood that the transformation wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone whose life had been touched by the simple, radical act of sharing authentic gifts without reservation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Thompson, the first she'd heard from him since rejecting his proposal months earlier. "Saw an article about your community program in the Tribune. Sounds like you found what you were really meant to do. Proud of you, Sylvie Grace." The message made her smile, not because she needed his validation, but because it represented the completion of a long journey. She was no longer Sylvie Grace, the artist who had compromised her authenticity for commercial success. She wasn't just Sylvie Washington, the woman who had hidden her gift to protect herself from exploitation. She had become someone new, someone who understood that the greatest transformation came not from changing yourself to meet others' expectations, but from becoming so completely yourself that you created space for others to do the same. As the last families prepared to leave that evening, little Charlotte Morrison reached up from her mother's arms towards Sylvie. babbling in the musical way that suggested she might have inherited something precious from their months together. Sylvie took the baby's small hand and began humming softly, not because Charlotte needed soothing, but because some gifts were meant to be shared simply for the joy of sharing them. The transformation was complete, but the story was just beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.